Hi everyone, and welcome back to OMN INSIGHT. My name is Sariti Kadir and I'm your host. And today I'm bringing you what I know is going to be an insightful and enthralling discussion with Angatu Yousuf, who is the co-founder of Team Free Oromia and the co-host at the Free Oromia podcast. And we're going to be talking about her work as an activist, as a media practitioner, and also about some of her views on the overall context in Oromia and Ethiopia. Thank you so much for joining us today, Angatu.
Thank you for having me, Surati. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure is mine. So we'll get straight into it, Angatu. I'm really curious to know, as one young woman who is part of this Kerok Arre generation and who has witnessed the Oromo struggle and Ethiopia at large undergo some of its most defining political moments, from the master plan and the revolution that it sparked, to the Prosperity Party era, to the assassination of Hachalu Hundessa, and to the political conditions that have defined the country in the years following it, including the war in Oromia and in Tigray. What have been some of your thoughts and your reflections in witnessing these trajectories, and in what ways have these events motivated or, I guess, shaped some of your intentions in starting the respective media platform that you co-host, the Free Oromia podcast?
Well, it's been quite the journey over the past few years in Ethiopia, hasn't it? And I think a vast majority of Oromo people can relate to the experience of it being an emotional roller coaster, witnessing the political turmoil that has been plaguing the country. I mean, for a long time, but especially so in the last sort of decade or slightly less. And there have been moments that have been incredibly inspirational and galvanizing, particularly the uprising of the Oromo youth, of the Kobe generation, and the role that they played in really shifting the political landscape in the country. And of course, there have been moments that have been deeply, deeply devastating, such as the assassination of Hachalu Hundessa and the thousands and tens of thousands of young Oromo people who have been killed, who have been maimed, who have been and are still imprisoned. So, of course, there have been a lot of tragedies over the past few years. But I think my overall takeaway from what has been happening is that we have immense power as a people, and that we are truly shifting the needle in the direction that we need to as a nation in order to achieve our full freedom.
And how has reflecting on these things and experiencing these things over the last few years, did this lead to the idea for the Free Oromia podcast? Tell me a little bit about how that podcast came about and, I guess, the intended mission of it.
Yeah, it absolutely did. The podcast was entirely inspired by the paradigm shifting impact of the Oromo protests. That's what motivated us to start the Free Oromia podcast and establish Team Free Oromia in the first place. For the first time since the sort of early 90s transition, the Oromo question really came to the forefront of Ethiopian politics through the movement that was created by the Kobe generation and that we now widely know as the Oromo protests. And the political discourse opened up across the Oromo nation and beyond, driven by the demands of that Kobe generation. So we created the podcast to contribute towards what we believe to be a critical aspect of the political dialogue that had opened up. And that's namely the possibility and aspiration of establishing an entirely sovereign and independent state of Oromia. So the core purpose of the Free Oromia podcast is to be a platform that's dedicated to centering and furthering the pursuit of an independent Oromia by raising consciousness about it and by normalizing the independence conversation, which I think to a large degree has been on the fringes of the political discussion until very recent years.
Thank you, Angatu, for that response. Allow me for one moment to play, I guess, what is termed, called the devil's advocate sometimes. But what would you say to people who would say that this ideal or this vision, this political outcome of an independent Oromia is divisive or is anti-Pan-Africanist or Pan-Africanism and isn't a productive political goal for Ethiopia or for the broader Horn region? How would you respond to commentary like that?
Well, I mean, I certainly understand that people might have those sorts of concerns, but I think it's entirely the opposite. I don't see anything that is anti-Pan-Africanist or anti-Pan-Africanism about championing a cause that will secure the liberty of indigenous African peoples, that will secure the freedom of those who live on the African continent, and that will allow them to self-rule and self-administer in a way that increases their capacity to really express themselves as African peoples. I think that only adds to the Pan-Africanist cause. And in regards to it being divisive, I also feel that that's a sort of fear tactic to call it that. I mean, let's be really honest, Ethiopia is not a cohesive society. It is already an extremely divided country and is only getting more and more divided exactly because the majority of the people in the country don't have their freedoms. They're not able to live as free and equal citizens in the country, and they're still under the yoke of the legacy of Ethiopian imperialism and colonization. So if we want cohesion, if we want a society that respects everybody equally, then we need to ensure that we create these sort of structures and the parameters that allow people to feel fully seen within their country, within their state, allow them to live with their full liberties. And that way we can actually establish cohesion when we have equal terms for everybody. And there is no reason why, and I think, this is another aspect of this matter of it being divisive. There is no reason why people who are not of the Oromo sort of ethnicity, why they couldn't live just as they do in Oromia now, while it is within the state of Ethiopia, when it is no longer within the state of Ethiopia. In fact, it will probably improve their lives and their living standards, because it would improve the lives and the living standards of all the people around them. And I think, a society that's better for everyone is also better for the individual.
A very well presented logic and argument there. Thank you so much for an inspiring answer. So on the podcast, I was looking through the contents that you have been releasing, you and the other hosts on the platform have been releasing over just more than a year, I think it is now. And alongside topics that are addressing the political crisis in Oromia and the rest of Ethiopia as well, including subtopics touching on things like independence referendum and other subtopics relating to the political outcome of an independent Oromia. There have been episodes on things like the Palestinian struggle, the Eritrean struggle. You also had an episode with organizers from Catalonia in Spain when they were organizing around a referendum of independence, also the arts in Oromia and much more. Can you tell me a little bit about, or say a little bit about the logic behind, this Oromo media platform with its identity in Oromoness, with its name and with its framework as well, but that's also having conversations pushing into the greater global South. What's the intent here? What's the overall message you're trying to communicate, not just in the Oromo context, but also beyond it?
So, I mean, the primary thing that we're seeking to communicate with the podcast is that believing in independence is not an extreme position to hold, as it's often painted to be. I mean, after all, the right to independence is a part of the Ethiopian constitution itself. And we seek to share information, knowledge, and ideas with the Oromo people and underinterested parties about independence for Oromia within a safe space. And you mentioned that we've sort of collaborated with people who represent similar struggles in other parts of the world. And one approach is that we've utilized. One approach that we have utilized is to highlight how our struggle is connected to other liberation movements in the world, and the parallels that exist with historical and contemporary struggles against imperialism and colonization, in order to help contextualize our struggle for our own and also wider audiences. And contextualizing our struggle in this way, we think, helps to increase the understanding of the Oromo question at large, and particularly so for outside observers. And we also seek to contribute towards communicating the boundless magnitude of Oromo epistemology, our ways of knowing and being in the world, what informs and defines Oromuma, such that our listeners can develop a greater understanding of what an independent Oromo nation would contribute to our global society. And that includes our arts, our culture and traditions, our governance practices, and also our many ways of life. But overall, we seek for our message to convey the advantage and necessity of independence as a goal for the Oromo struggle.
Thank you so much for that response, Angatu. We're going to be right back and taking this conversation up from exactly where we've left it off here, but we have a short announcement to play at this point.
imal dheeraa waggoottan sagalee keessa dhuga Oromoo karaa dhugaatiin immoo fi yaalii gargara godhaa turree amma lakkuma kan godhu irratti argamna. Kanaaf humna namaatiif teknooloojiin cimoon bar diijitaalawaa kan keessa dirqam filannoo biraan qabnu waan taateef tumsa hawaasa keenya barbaanna. Haalum kanaan duub koreen deeggarsa OMN Joorjii Atlaantaa tagaygaaf guyyaa 12 bara 2023 marii hawaasa qopheessite jirti. Hayyuun Oromoo Profeesar Mahammad Hasan, Dr. Baayyaana Soobaa, Daareektarri olaanaan OMN Dajanee guutamaatiif qindeessaan koree deeggarsa OMN Kadame Atlaantaa aabbamaan tashite baan keessummoot jedhu gaaddisi qora 4156 Laavista Road Tukaar GS 384 biratti argama. Bilbilli yookaan Simoon kunooti 6786 98 duwwa 998 nuu dha'uu dandeetti. Kun ta'uu dinnaan pilaas 1078 dhibba 431 43 15 irra yoo nuu cuqaaftan nu argaati.
So Angatu, you have talked a lot about and very eloquently about the need to center the political goal of independence at this particular political juncture of the Oromo struggle. This is not language that I think I've seen at all when it comes to articulations offered by the global community in its understanding of the Oromo context or of the Ethiopian context, even more broadly. What do you think the global community is missing about understanding the Oromo political context?
Well, I mean, I think a key thing that the global community is missing is the understanding that the Oromo political context is rooted in dismantling the legacy of colonial oppression. I think most sort of international parties don't necessarily recognize that Ethiopia is an empire in exactly the same way that they understand other empires, former empires, the British Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the Spanish Empire, the French Empire. It's an empire in exactly the same sense as those other empires were. The only difference is that the Ethiopian empire still exists. And the people who were colonized and oppressed by the Ethiopian Empire are still living in conditions or under conditions that were established by that imperial state. So political and social structures still reflect those imperialistic and colonial legacies. And it is a large reason why the vast majority of the Ethiopian population are living in such abject poverty. And why their rights and freedoms are so often not respected, to put it mildly. You know, the international community is very concerned with peace in Ethiopia and in the Horn of Africa in general, because they recognize that peace in the Horn of Africa is very largely dependent on peace in Ethiopia. But they're not properly engaging with the root causes of unrest in the Ethiopian state. And without doing so, you're never going to find real solutions. And I think also there are widespread misconceptions about the Oromo political question in particular, due to Ethiopian propaganda, particularly in regards to the armed struggle, where liberation fighters, freedom fighters, are essentially painted as terrorists rather than defenders of people's freedoms and rights. So that kind of compounds the international misconceptions and lack of understanding about the core issues in the Ethiopian state.
And as a storyteller, Angatu, what would you say we could do better? The Oromo community / nation in the country, outside the country, could do better in its advocacy efforts or in its documentation efforts in telling the Oromo story, sharing it with the global community?
You know, I find this to be a difficult question because you know, the first thought that comes into my mind is, who am I to say? But you know, I think as a nation, we have in many ways tried our utmost to make our stories heard, to bring our narrative to the forefront of the political discourse in Ethiopia and beyond. I think a major challenge and barrier for us is that, you know, we've never truly had, you know, a proper stake in the political landscape in Ethiopia, where we've had, you know, a clear and uninterrupted space to really put our narratives across, to really put our questions forward without distortion, without propaganda. And so we've had to organize in the shadows, essentially, of the Ethiopian state. And while we've been organizing, I think, reasonably effectively in those shadows, the fact of the matter is there is, you know, a state apparatus that is in the light, so to speak, that gets to dominate the narrative because of the power that it holds. But I think some things that I think we could improve upon within our own spaces, and, you know, to try and help and push our narratives out from the shadows and into the light, so to speak, is to be more cohesive about the outcomes that we're seeking in concrete terms. Because of course, we all want peace, we all want freedom, we all want stability, but what does that actually mean? Politically speaking, what is the political, social sort of state outcome that we're seeking for the Oromo nation? And can we find a more common line in regard to what the answer to that would be? I think if, you know, a majority of the Oromo nation are able to kind of galvanize behind you a common idea of what the outcome for Oromia should be, then that can definitely help to propel our narrative and the trajectory of our struggle forward much more effectively. So that's something that I think we could perhaps work on, establishing that consensus amongst ourselves as a people, and then working collectively and cohesively towards that common goal. Yeah, and I mean, we have, I can, primarily speak on what I see in the diaspora. And in the diaspora, we have many organizations, across many countries. And we are a very large nation at the end of the day. And we have so many kind of subsections within our within our own nationhood that would be difficult to organize in a stable and peaceful country on a good day. So considering our circumstances, we're really kind of on an uphill battle, right? But I think understanding that and being more intentional about addressing the issues and the frictions that this kind of inherent state of our people might cause, I think would help us to build that cohesion, much more, again, effectively, and increase our collaboration across the organizations that we have in different countries and on different continents, and then globally.
I really enjoyed the layers of context that you provided in that analysis, Angatu. Thank you so much for making the time to join us here today. And yeah, thank you for the wonderful insights you provided.
Thank you again very much. It's been my pleasure entirely. And I hope to speak to you again soon.
We will. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.
That was Angatu Yousuf, co-founder of Team Free Oromia and co-host of the Free Oromia podcast. I think that's the first time that I've had somebody on this show who has spoken so extensively about a political outcome or the political outcome of independence for Oromia, which is a narrative that very much does exist amongst the Oromo political discourse, and that I look forward to hopefully exploring in other ways in the future. That's all for today. My name is Sariti Kadir. You're watching OMN INSIGHT, and I look forward to talking to you soon.
imal dheeraa waggoottan sagalee keessa dhuga Oromoo karaa dhugaatiin immoo fi yaalii gargara godhaa turree amma lakkuma kan godhu irratti argamna. Kanaaf humna namaatiif teknooloojiin cimoon bar diijitaalawaa kan keessa dirqam filannoo biraan qabnu waan taateef tumsa hawaasa keenya barbaanna. Haalum kanaan duub horeen deeggarsa OMN Joorjii Atlaantaa tagaygaaf guyyaa 12 bara 2023 marii hawaasa qopheessite jirti. Hayyuun Oromoo Profeesar Mahammad Hasan, Dr. Baayyaana Soobaa, Daareektarri olaanaan OMN Dajanee guutamaatiif qindeessaan kore deeggarsa OMN Kadame Atlaantaa aabbamaan tashite baankii summoot jedhu gaaddisi qora 4156 Laavista Road Tukaar GA 384 biratti argama. Bilbilli yookaan simuun kunooti 6786 98 duwwa 998 nuu dha'uu dandeetti. Kun ta'uu dinnaan pilaas 1678 431 43 15 irra yoo nuu cuqaaftan nu argaati.